Tell you what doesn't feel heroic is the let's go lock ourselves in a room before we fight Strahd so that I can get my 7th level spell slot back, right?
Hey there, adventurers. Welcome back to Short Rest Studios. I'm Judd, and I'm scouting out the best the TTRPG world has to offer so you don't have to quest alone. MCDM lead designer James Introcaso and I recently talked about how Draw Steel flips the script on resources and resting, possibly the most boring D&D mechanic. But make sure you stick around for some great GM advice and a look at the latest MCDM project, Crows, which is currently in development. Draw Steel's gameplay loop is one of the things that stand out the most about the game, and that core element is where Draw Steel really subverts traditional D&D resting and resources.
And this is one of the first things that Matt and I really came up with when we were developing the game, right? Which is this idea of like, we talked a lot about heroic fantasy and what makes a heroic story, and we were like, tell you what doesn't feel heroic is the let's go lock ourselves in a room before we fight Strahd so that I can get my 7th level spell slot back, right? And I think that's a hallmark of dungeon crawling and awesome in a dungeon crawling game. But in a heroic game, you're like, no, you need to be, Bruce Willis is like beaten and battered by the end of Die Hard, but he keeps pressing on, right? Until he gets to face off with Hans Gruber. And so we needed that moment. And so we came up with this idea of like, your healing dwindles down as you go. So you will eventually need to rest, right? And you're putting yourself at risk, but your resources build up, right? So you have these heroic resources that you gain in combat round after round. You get more and more. You spend them on abilities. The bigger and more impactful the ability is, right, the more it costs. In 5e terms, if you want to cast a 5th level spell, you need to build up a lot of heroic resources and then use it. Right. So instead of using the cool thing at the beginning of the fight, you build up to it so that the fight itself gets cooler.
Yeah, we went right from that into one of my favorite aspects of the game, victories, those resources that convert to experience points.
Then there's this concept of victories, which is each time you want to fight, solve a puzzle, are successful in a negotiation or in a montage test, right? You get what's called a victory. And each battle, you start with heroic resources equal to your victories, right? And so if you have like not a lot of healing resources left, because your healing resources do dwindle throughout the day, but like 6 victories, you're like, we should go fight the boss because I'm going to be able to do a lot of cool stuff at the beginning, middle, and end of this fight if we go now. But if we rest to get our healing resources back, I won't. Right. And so it's this fun, like, push your luck, keep going forward mechanic. And then eventually you do rest. And when you rest, your victories convert into XP. And then you need so many XP to level up. Right. And that's the basic gameplay loop. And that's what I am definitely most proud of in Draw Steel.
And that's one of my favorite things about it. I just thought that was really cool, just the idea that you get better as you go. James and the team at MCDM really wanted to build Draw Steel from the ground up, but when you've played D&D for a long time, you develop something I like to call D&D Brain. You get so used to certain aspects of the game that you have a hard time doing things differently. James and Matt Colville and the MCDM design team were no exception to this. I asked James what they had the hardest time letting go of, and here's what he had to say.
Yeah, there were a couple things that I think one of the biggest things that was hard for us to let go, and we didn't even realize we were doing it, was equipment, right? And we did eventually, right? Like our equipment system in Draw Steel is basically all like abstracted except for magic items, right? That like, you have a kit, which is a collection of like armor and weapons and a fighting style that you kind of adopt and can change and swap out and that sort of thing. But it took us a long time to get there because we were like, well, you gotta have armor. You gotta have a long sword and a short sword and a great sword, and they all have to have a difference. But what is that difference, and how is that meaningfully heroic? Like, how do we blah, 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 right? Like, and Matt and I had tons of meetings about that. And that was probably the thing that was hardest for us to let go of because we were just so used to that being part of the game that we made this assumption of like, you have to come in this way. Even though we had played games where you didn't have to do that, right? And it took us a while, and I think Matt was finally the one who was like, wait a second, when I play, a game like this, I pick like a loadout, and that loadout is just sort of like it's an outfit that comes with guns and blah, blah, blah. And then I'm like, good to go. And that meant that like, oh, okay. So rather than trying to figure out like, how are all three of these swords different from each other? And then all three of these axes and all three of these spears and all three of these bludgeoning weapons, right? It was like, no, we can just say like, how is, hey, I am, right, Draw Steel Heroic, it's all about archetypes, right? So it's like, hey, I want to be the knight in shining armor. Cool, we know what that means. We know what that looks like. You should be able to do this, this, and this. It means you're big, you're heavy, you're armored. You probably don't move really quick, but you have a lot of good defensive stuff, right? Like, okay, cool, we got that. What does it mean about this, right? And so, like, that was all stuff that we started to crack. And once we realized we didn't have to do it that way, right? We could think about equipment differently. And it was funny because after that, every meeting we had was approached with like, before we talk about skills, as like how should we implement them, let's talk about what is the purpose of skills.
Yeah. Do we even have to have
in
them?
an RPG? Yeah. Do we even have to have them?
Yeah.
Exactly. Right. And so there would be like usually a half-hour discussion just about that. Like, well, what would it mean? Well, skills mean that you can specialize in something. Is that a thing that we think is important in Draw Steel? We do, but we also don't think it should mean that like you can attempt the task, right? That's a big thing that like we think about with skills as players is like a player will be like, oh, I don't have persuasion, so I'm not going to speak. It's like, well, you got a decent charisma, you could give it a shot. Nope, not going to do it, right? And so we wanted to break players of that habit. So it's like, well, we can make skills less important, but they can still tell a story, and yeah, right. So like that was sort of a lot of discussions were had like that. Yeah. And it was hard because like we would have to, in playtesting, we would get feedback that was like, why did you change the way the fighter works? And we were like, this game never had a fighter. Right, it's not that was never a class, that's never a term we used, right? Like, we didn't change the way the fighter worked. We never had it to begin with.
Ladies and gentlemen, that is D&D Brain.
Yeah.
James and the team are not resting on their laurels. They're creating tons of new Draw Steel products, and James himself is hard at work on Crows, a dark, well, I'll let him tell you in his own words. Crows, which is the project you currently have in development. Give us the elevator pitch. Tell us about what Crows is.
Yeah, so Crows is a dungeon crawling survival horror post-apocalyptic fantasy role-playing game. And the idea of Crows is, right, like you are going to go into a dungeon and you're going to try to come out richer than you were, and it is going to be a lethal experience against strange, horrific monsters and deadly traps and hazards and things like that. And so it uses the Draw Steel core mechanic, the power roll, right? But you are not building up resources, you are winnowing them away. And the game is equipment based. So meaning that like what you can do is determined by the stuff that you bring with you into the dungeon, more so than like any traits or abilities or skills that you have. Those things might make you better at using those equipment, but like the way you cast a spell is you have the spell book with the spell that you want to cast in it. And hey, Judd, maybe your character should cast this spell because I'm dead now. You can pull it off my body and you can attempt to cast spells, right? And so that's the basic thing. It's scary, and also it should be fun to die. And Crow, speaking of fun being king, right? We want it to be fun when you die.
How deep into development of that game are you at this point?
Good question. So I think we're maybe a month to 2 months away from the first public play test of the game. So I'm working hard. It's basically just me right now doing the design, because we're also, the rest of the team is still supporting Draw Steel, right? There's tons of Draw Steel products coming out. But I've had a bunch of play tests at conventions that I have run, and now I'm trying to get it into a place where someone who is not me could run a playtest, right? And so that requires like writing all the rules down, not just shorthand, that kind of thing. And because we're starting with a public playtest, I want to give people a significant chunk of the game.
Hey, if you want to hear more of my conversation with James, head over to patreon.com/shortreststudios and join the Adventurers Guild, where you can get access to full-length game designer interviews. But for now, I'm going to let James leave you with some great advice for what to do when the dice aren't rolling in your player's favor.
Killing everybody is a thing that can be fun for some groups, but like taking people prisoner, right? Splitting the party, saying like, hey, you guys are down and out. And so what that means is the village got destroyed, but the villains made you watch as it happened. Those kinds of things feel like amazing story moments then, right? And so like figure out the way, if you were writing the television show, right, of this thing, and you were like, the heroes need to lose here because that's what the dice are saying, or that's what your head writer is saying, right? You would be like, okay, but we can't kill off the cast of, right, like everybody, otherwise the audience doesn't come back. So what do? Well, we're going to do something that changes them. We're going to give you, the players, a chance for character development, right? And that, to me, is the kind of thing that then the players embrace. And they might like hate it, quote unquote. They're going to hate that it's happening, but they love it as players because they're like, oh yeah, I'm so mad and I can't wait till we get a second crack and we get to kill these guys. And, you know, as opposed to like, well, now you're dead and now you got to go on a quest to resurrect that person, right? Like, no, make them take somebody prisoner, make them, you know, knock them out. They all wake up in a cell, or they watch the demise of whatever, right? They watch, even if, you know, like, that's the thing, is we don't want to necessarily kill beloved NPCs because that could frustrate them too. But you sure could capture them and have them screaming as they ride away, right? And it's like, now there's a quest, right? This opportunity is turned into a whole new thing. So that's what I would say is like, it doesn't need to be death, and it can be something far more devastating, which is more fun.
Adventurers, those are some of the highlights from my conversation with James Introcaso, the lead designer of Draw Steel. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, and consider becoming part of the Adventurers Guild at patreon.com/shortreststudios, or by hitting the join button under this video. Not only can you get access to my full interview with James, but you can get a great library of Dice and Logos maps, access to my campaign notes, and even the opportunity to help me decide what games I talk about next. Draw Steel's combat system is fantastic. Check it out in this video, and I'll see you on the next short rest. And remember, you don't have to quest alone.